Did you tailor it to Shoreview? Because I read probably too late Paige's note. You,
Oh, a little bit, yeah.
okay, you didn't have to, I just was curious.
Yeah.
Okay,
I can only get so granular with
that's true.
yeah.
That's true.
I did what I could.
I'm excited to listen to it.
Oh, good.
See
Hopefully,
what.
I gave a presentation Forest Lake, maybe a month and a half ago, and I think I left them all really depressed. So I'm gonna try to do better this time. So
You know, it is what it
not,
is. And
it
maybe
is.
that'll take, we were just discussing on things to take action on, so
Sure.
hopefully it'll trigger. But I imagine Trump had some effect on programs or not?
I think what we're experiencing is going to be kind of a trickling effect of like other parts of the state enterprise losing federal funding. And so that kind of reshuffling, reprioritization of where money is going and that kind of mid to longer term impact. Because right now we've been really fortunate that our work in Minnesota has been very well funded, or at least funded by the legislature,
Okay.
using state funding for the most part.
All right.
But yeah, so question marks about
Okay.
that kind of stuff.
Oh, ready? Okay, welcome to the March speaker series. Today's topic is on polyfluoroalkyls or PFAS. Sorry. Should I start again or? Welcome to the March speaker series. Today's topic is on polyfluoroalkyls or PFAS, also called forever chemicals. Today's guest speaker is Fox Char. Fox currently serves as the agency's PFAS coordinator at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Fox coordinates and collaborates with staff and leadership across the MPCA and at other state agencies and acts as a liaison with other states, federal partners, and a variety of other stakeholders to advance the goals identified under PFAS Blueprint. In 2001, several Minnesota state agencies came together to publish the PFAS Blueprint, which identified potential paths forward to prevent, mitigate, and clean up PFAS pollution across Minnesota. This presentation covers the progress made in the time since publication. Welcome.
I'll try really hard to not wander away from this microphone. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Kathy. Fox Char at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. As Kathy said, I am the PFAS coordinator, and I kind of tell people that it's my business to be in everybody else's business. I have to know what everybody is up to. So I'm talking here today about a lot of good work that's going on across the agency and across the state agencies kind of collectively. But I need to always start with like, this is work that other people are doing, and I'm just here to uplift it and showcase it. So happy to take whatever questions I can, of course, at the end, and if I can't answer something, I will circle back. But here we are. Oh, I went too fast. So we're gonna talk today. This is kind of a long agenda. I will do my best to make it very interesting. We'll talk about why PFAS or forever chemicals are an issue, talk about our first understandings of PFAS pollution in Minnesota, our response to that pollution, how we prioritize our response basically, and I will talk significantly about the prohibitions that are in place right now. I'll talk a little bit, because this is an environmental body plus the public, whoever is able to join us, a little bit about PFAS in the environment in Minnesota and some kind of standards that we have, for example, and then kind of looking ahead what this group could do, or what community members in Shoreview and surrounding areas could do. So here we go. What are PFAS or PFAS? Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a mouthful, which is why we call them PFAS, but that doesn't, it's an acronym, right? We like to use acronyms because government. So here we are with PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. This one here on the screen, as you can see, I'll use my little mouse here. These black spheres here, this is a carbon, what we call a carbon backbone, a chain of carbons. These green circles on these carbons here are fluorines, and then in this case, this is a sulfonic acid here in the end. But the idea is that these chemicals are a series of some number of carbons, depends on who you ask, one or more carbons, with these carbon-fluorine bonds. And because there are so many ways to produce these carbons, these PFAS, depending on whose definition you're using, we're talking somewhere between 14,000 and about 7 million potential chemicals that fall into this class. I'll say that EPA is on the lower end of that estimate. There's an international body called the OECD, and I forget what the acronym is because it's in French, and I do not speak French. But is a European organization with the EU, but is also a definition that's adapted by researchers globally. So depending on who you ask, many, many PFAS chemistries at least possible, and they all serve different purposes in a lot of ways. I'll get into that in a little bit here, so I won't jump ahead too far. So why are PFAS an issue? This slide is very human health focused, a little bit less environmentally focused, but small amounts of PFAS are harmful. I'll show some numbers later, but the most recent revisions from the Department of Health for PFAS in drinking water in parts per quadrillion. So we're talking, I mean, I can't even make that with my fingers. It's below what most environmental labs are able to detect in the environment. So very small amounts have been linked to cancer and non-cancer outcomes in humans. They are what we call bioaccumulative. So as we are exposed, and we humans, people, plants, animals, are exposed to PFAS chemicals in our environment, they accumulate in our bodies. And there are ways to reduce that in our bodies, and I can talk about that later too. But once PFAS are in either the environment or in our human waste streams, for example, they're extremely difficult to destroy and treat, thus the name forever chemicals. The carbon-fluorine bond is perhaps, arguably, I've seen arguably the strongest chemical bond possible, which is why that bond does not break by any known natural process, except maybe volcanoes. I've seen some research that volcanic activity can potentially break those bonds under high heat and pressure, but unless we're throwing PFAS into Mount Doom, the point is they don't really degrade in nature. Why do we have PFAS? My understanding continues to change as like the early part of the timeline changes depending on who you're talking about. But the most recently, I've learned that they were associated with the Manhattan Project and military applications, and then different types, that's Teflon, specifically PTFE, one type of PFAS. Other types of PFAS were developed in mid-century, 1950s or so. They're really great, unfortunately, at what they do. They make things really waterproof. They make things non-stick. They're stain resistant. They have qualities that, as modern humans, we have come to expect in a lot of our products that we spend money on and have in our homes. I have 2 little kids at home, so like before I took this job, I was like, yes, I don't want stains and everything, please. And now here we are. But anyway, so PFAS compounds have been now used for several decades in consumer products because of these really nice qualities. And in some cases, their qualities, they're used in medical devices, veterinary devices, electric vehicles, all kinds of things that we see now as really beneficial and important to modern society. So that's why they're an issue, is because they were used very prevalently. This is a very nice, our communications folks are wonderful. I did not make this. Very nice image of how PFAS may enter and then move through the environment. So all PFAS are human-made. There are no naturally occurring PFAS. They all start in some kind of industry, which is this circle here. They're then released either as products that we consume. They are released in the waste from those industries, whether that's solid waste or wastewater. And then, of course, once they are in products, they enter our homes, and then from our homes, they enter landfills or wastewater. Let's see, the reason that it's in groundwater is because we have these wastewater discharges, but there are also direct discharges from industry into groundwater, can go into soil. Part of the reason that PFAS in Minnesota are such a big deal is because of historic landfilling by 3M in Washington County in particular. They're old closed dump and landfill sites that were not lined. And so very slowly over decades, all of the waste that had been in there was slowly leaching into the soil and groundwater under those unlined landfills. And here we are with contaminated groundwater. So as you can see, there are a lot of different ways that PFAS chemicals move around in the environment and in our waste as people, but they did all have, at some point, a manufacturing origin. I talked a little bit about the bioaccumulative nature and how of PFAS and how very, very small amounts can be problematic, but this is just an example of some of the known health effects that have been demonstrated associated with PFAS contamination. Immune suppression, developmental effects, reproductive effects. These are all issues that our own Department of Health has confirmed using their own toxicity evaluations for different PFAS chemicals. People can be exposed to PFAS contamination in all kinds of different ways. People focus a lot generally on drinking water because drinking water is very important. Everybody needs to drink water. It's vital to human life, to other life as well. So people are rightfully very, very interested in having safe drinking water. But there are other ways that people can be exposed to PFAS too, and that includes, I have on here fish consumption. As we all know, fish live in water. And so if we've got fish in contaminated water, they also bioaccumulate these chemicals in their tissues. Other food can have PFAS chemicals in it depending on where that food was grown and how it was grown. I mentioned that there are ways to reduce the amount of PFAS in your body, and unfortunately, one of those ways is breastfeeding. There's been a lot of research that shows that people who are breast or chest feeding actually slough that toxicity into the milk that they're giving to their infants. So that's a pretty sobering fact too. Air exposure, we do know that there are PFAS in the air. A lot of fluorinated gases, refrigerants are also PFAS by definition. So having a lot of conversations about that recently with folks. Of course, dermal contact, PFAS in cosmetics has been a concern. So there are potentially many ways of exposure. And of course, everybody's exposure is going to be a little bit different, and not everything has PFAS in it necessarily. But there are a lot of places that you will find it and that you could be exposed. And then, of course, different PFAS are used in different products. I had mentioned Teflon, which at that time, I think it was used to like line tanks or something, was its original development. Kind of a fascinating history. I probably shouldn't say things I can't for sure confirm, so maybe strike that from the record. But just as an example, I was going to say that Teflon and PTFE are associated with cookware, right? So you're going to find that in cookware, and you might not find that in some other product, ski wax or something, for example. I had also talked about the difficulty of treating and destroying PFAS. On top of just being difficult to treat and destroy at a physical level, purchasing PFAS versus destroying it, there's a huge cost differential as well. If you were to go online and buy a pound of PFAS, which is a thing I've never tried to do, I guess, but someone priced it out for us here as part of a report that was funded by the LCCMR. We're looking at a 50 to 1,000 pounds, depending on the type of PFAS chemical. And then once that chemical, and I harken back to that image I showed where the PFAS are moving through the environment in every which way, once that's in our waste stream, for example, we're looking at $2 to $18 million to remove that. Once those PFAS chemicals are no longer in a concentrated waste stream and are diffused into solid waste leachate, which is the sloppy, goopy water that they send to wastewater treatment plants, or just the sewage coming from people's homes, it's way more expensive to try to remove that, just based on existing technology. Oh no. Well, in the slides that I had, I forget that this does that as a PDF. My fault. There's some really pretty images that go with this timeline, but we're gonna just imagine them together. This one here is a map of Minnesota. So the history, anyway, is the point of this, or timeline. So I had mentioned that PFAS had been found associated with these old dump sites. It was about 2002, 2004 timeline that the Department of Health sampled for these in groundwater near these sites and started finding them. So since early 2000s, we as a state have been addressing PFAS to some degree. The Department of Health had done some drinking water well testing in the East Metro because of that. And since then, both in the East Metro and throughout greater Minnesota and other parts of the Metro, I should say too, efforts to characterize which PFAS are where have expanded. We have a relatively good idea, as good an idea as anybody can, based on groundwater mapping, which is not an exact science. It's cool, but it's not exact, given the 3 dimensions, and underground aquifers are not just big pools of water. We're finding PFAS. Our understanding of the toxicity of PFAS compounds changes, both as we as a state do studies and as others in the United States and across the world look at both their environmental and human health impacts. And then, like I had mentioned before, over the course of time, because of that changing understanding of their toxicity and impacts to people, we revise our health-based values according to the best, most recent science that we have, and they continue to get smaller and smaller. We are, of course, continuing to find PFAS compounds in our wastewater, in our air, in our soil, in solid waste, in fish across the state. So it's not necessarily in 100% of everywhere that we look, but there are PFAS compounds that we've detected all over the state in all kinds of different media. So it is a widespread problem. So the PFAS Blueprint that Kathy had mentioned, and that is kind of the focus indirectly of this presentation, was a document that we as the state anyway published in February of 2021. Both MPCA and the Department of Health worked carefully on this document, along with the Department of Natural Resources and Agriculture. So it was very much an interagency collaboration to publish this 200-page, massive, super in-depth, but not nearly in-depth enough, just given the nature of PFAS contamination. But this blueprint was divided into 10 white papers effectively, and these white papers covered, as you can see on the screen here, hopefully, these varying topics, including pollution prevention, and kind of ranging all the way to how do we manage PFAS at the end of its life cycle, end of product life cycle or in waste streams. So each of these 10 topic areas has had tons of state resources dedicated to it. I was mentioning to Kathy previously that we have been very fortunate and grateful to the legislature for continued appropriations to be able to do a lot of this work, and continued support in that way, which is not something that many states have, even though they also have PFAS contamination. So for better or worse, our experience with PFAS in Minnesota has allowed us to be better resourced than others. But we have done a ton of work here. It's ongoing, it's iterative as we continue to learn more about PFAS chemicals. Like I've said in a few different contexts, we continue to update our understanding and update how we measure PFAS, how we quantify risks to health. I'll talk about drinking water a little bit. So all of these different areas, and I'm happy to go further into them if people have specific questions at the end. But we've definitely, as a state, put a lot of energy and time into trying to address PFAS from these 10 different lenses and more. That one's gone too. Good to know. So the blueprint itself boils down into 3 kind of buckets or response actions. Prevention, when we can, managing pollution, PFAS pollution that's already in our waste stream or already in the environment, and then cleaning up contaminated sites. This is universal. This isn't unique to PFAS necessarily, but this is kind of those 10 topical areas that kind of boil down into these 3 broader categories. And I'll talk about those now in reverse order. So cleaning up or remediating PFAS. When we talk about remediation in the state, kind of aligns generally with federal Superfund, state Superfund. There's some nuance to that. It's not entirely an overlap, but you can think of it kind of broadly like that. So as part of the PFAS Blueprint, our remediation programs at the MPCA worked with other state agencies and partners to develop a PFAS-specific cleanup or remediation guidance. And it turns out that was published as a series of 9 documents. So you can see the guidance structure here. Each of these circle arrows is a different specific guidance document. And those are the life cycle of cleanup or site remediation. It begins with initial site review, then investigation, risk assessment, remediation, and eventually closure, or at least no further action. So those are activities that are specific to our cleanup programs under different federal and state statutory and regulatory frameworks. And then we have the 4 what they call cross-cutting areas that are listed on that arrow beneath. And so those are topics that kind of span the entire life cycle, if you will. So brownfields, the repurposing of sites, disposal, in this case, of contaminated media when they're doing cleanups, communicating about exposure and risk and what a cleanup looks like for a specific site, and engaging communities in what that process should or could look like and how to close sites. So again, cross-cuts across all of these different life cycles. And then, of course, considerations for environmental justice. Again, working with communities where possible and other partners to make sure that everyone's needs are being met. As another result of the PFAS Blueprint, we identified different types of facilities, industrial, municipal, or domestic facilities where we thought there probably would be PFAS in Minnesota entering the environment. And so in 2022, the MPCA published this PFAS monitoring plan. And the goal of this monitoring plan was specifically to look for PFAS in places where we thought we would find it, to confirm our understanding of sources to the environment. So we looked at solid waste facilities, both municipal mixed solid waste landfills, looked at construction and demolition landfills, We looked at different types of industrial facilities with different types of permits issued by the MPCA, whether that be wastewater or stormwater permits or air permits in some cases. We looked at municipal wastewater treatment plants. Our municipal wastewater program has a really good, positive working relationship with local governments who run and utilities that run their wastewater treatment facilities. So we always look to partner with them when we can. And then because of the presence of PFAS chemicals in fluorinated firefighting foams, we did a lot of work to look at regional airports in greater Minnesota as well. So results of the monitoring plan, we confirmed what we thought we would find, which is that certain industrial facilities are associated with expected releases of PFAS into the environment. So for example, we found them at all of those regional airports where we sampled for stormwater. We found them at wastewater treatment facilities and at landfills, which we would expect because PFAS are in our household waste and it ends up in landfills. So one of the big takeaways from the monitoring plan is how challenging it is to collect PFAS data for some media, both just from the logistical standpoint of actually collecting samples, but also the lab analysis for PFAS has been moving along, but hasn't quite caught up to where we would need it to, for example, be able to detect parts per quadrillion of a specific PFAS compound in an aquifer. So there are next steps that we've identified. Many of our permitting programs are actively helping facilities do source identification reduction work, doing targeted investigations, like it says, at sites where there was elevated or immediate risks to drinking water supplies. As you might imagine, MPCA and the Department of Health prioritize areas where we know or expect there will be impacts to drinking water. So definitely at the top of our priority list. We have a lot of data that we collected as part of the monitoring plan, so continuing to evaluate both those data and then other data we get in other ways, and then developing other permitting strategies. And PCA is, at its core, a regulatory agency, and so many of our programs are built off of our authorities under these permitting programs to actually address environmental releases. So now I'll pivot over to preventing pollution in the first place. As with all contaminants, pollution prevention is the best way to keep them out of out of the environment and out of our bodies. So we were very fortunate that our legislature in 2023 took precedent from some other pollutants and passed a series of prohibitions. Some of them were before 2023, and I'll talk about those too, but Amara's law in particular is the consumer products prohibition on intentionally added PFAS. And so we've been very fortunate to have that in Minnesota. Here is, I should say, a short timeline of our pollution prevention laws in Minnesota. Our first laws went on the books actually in 2020 after the 2019 session. Our first prohibitions that resulted from the 2023 session took effect on January 1st of 24. Both those early ones included PFAS and firefighting foams under certain conditions. There is some federal preemption there, but that's what those exceptions are. And then actually on January 1st of 24, prohibition went into effect on the use of intentionally added PFAS in food packaging in Minnesota. So as you might imagine, there was a lot of heartburn around that time about, well, what is our experience as consumers going to look like? How will that change? And I anecdotally haven't hardly noticed a change at all, so I think that's good, but enforcement is in progress where needed. But anyway, the big chunk of prohibitions here as a result of 2023 legislative session are what we call Amara's law. Amara Strandy was a young woman who was diagnosed with an extremely rare form of cancer that she attributed to PFAS exposure in the East Metro. And so the legislature named this law in her honor because she was a very strong advocate for passing that in the state. So we continue to honor Amara's work and her family's continued work in this space by calling it Amara's Law. But anyway, so January 1st, 2025, intentionally added, PFAS intentionally added to products in 11 consumer product categories were prohibited. Those included things like dental floss, upholstery, carpets and rugs, ski wax, kind of what you might imagine as the low-hanging fruit of consumer products that we encounter every day, and therefore our exposure to PFAS from them may be greater, and our risk then, of course, would be greater too. As of July 1st of 2026, so this year, we, as part of this law, have required any manufacturers, as defined in statute, to report on how much PFAS, which types, which products they're in, and other things like that to the MPCA, and those data are going to be public as much as possible. Of course, we have some business information, confidential business information that we may have to protect in some cases because there are unique PFAS chemicals to different types of manufacturing. But this includes everybody who's planning to continue selling products between now and January 1st of 2032, which is when a kind of economy-wide ban will go into effect. All products with intentionally added PFAS will be prohibited for sale or distribution in Minnesota at that time. I'll also mention, because it doesn't fit in super well in this slide anyway, that there has been a prohibition on certain pesticides as well. I had mentioned fluorinated gases and refrigerants earlier, but pesticides are another category where there are several types of pesticides that meet Minnesota's statutory definitions of PFAS, and so there has been concern because those are obviously applied directly to the environment in some way or another. And there's a similar prohibition on January 1st of 2032. The Department of Agriculture cannot register those products anymore for use in Minnesota unless they are determined to be a currently unavoidable use, which we have mentioned on this slide as well. I'll talk just a little bit more about Amara's Law. It is unique among states because of how restrictive and forward-looking it is. There are other states that have passed laws very much like Amara's Law, but many of them have large kind of exemptions or carve-outs for certain things that, for one reason or another, prevented those laws from being kind of broad. For example, New Mexico has a prohibition law very similar to ours, but they have exempted fluoropolymers. So cookware, basically anything that has Teflon in it, does not fall under their prohibition at this time. California recently also, Governor Newsom vetoed a bill that would have also included fluoropolymers in their prohibition laws. So it's gone kind of piecemeal. There are states out front like Minnesota that do have these broad and kind of flexible, forward-looking laws on the books, but it's not everybody. So we continue, again, to appreciate the support of folks in the legislature on these prohibitions. I'm going to do a really big pivot now. I couldn't figure out a good segue for this. So now we're just going to talk about PFAS in the environment, and I kind of struggled with how I wanted to talk about this, so I'm just going to talk about it in this way. There are a lot of acronyms and technical words on this slide, but the takeaways are we have a few health-based values for PFAS in different environmental media in Minnesota. We have drinking water standards because there are federal drinking water standards for PFAS. Our state rules also incorporate those federal drinking water standards as what we call Class 1 water quality standards. And that covers basically any water in the state that has been designated or could be designated as domestic drinking water. So groundwater and certain surface waters, so lake streams, rivers. We also have some surface water quality standards. Those class 1 standards that I mentioned are human health protective. And then we have what we call site-specific water quality criteria, which are applicable in this case to some waters in the Twin Cities metro area, primarily associated again with historical 3M contamination. And then we have some non-regulatory values. So these are things where we have health-based values, but those values are not enforceable in any way. They're used, for example, our health risk limits are values that are used by our remediation programs as cleanup targets for contaminated wells, drinking water wells, for example. We have soil reference values, which are, again, human health-based values that are thresholds for action for if we find contaminated soil associated with a Superfund project or something like that. And then we also have risk assessment advice, which is kind of like a health risk limit, but for air. I don't know why they couldn't call them all the same thing, but they're all different because we're talking about different media. And those are based on exposure to PFAS and ambient air. And that's kind of where the list ends as far as what we have health-based numbers for. And these are Minnesota specific. Many of them are derived either based on or referencing national or federal numbers that maybe EPA, for example, would publish. But this is what we've got right now. We have very few purely regulatory values for PFAS. We have a few non-regulatory ones. We have a lot of different things that the MPCA specifically does not have PFAS values for. And again, I apologize for the number of, I threw these slides in kind of last minute, so they have a lot of acronyms on them, and I apologize for that. But we don't have national standards for PFAS in air. We don't have national standards for PFAS being emitted from specific facilities that have air permits. We don't have what we call Class 2 water quality standards, which are aquatic life standards. We don't have effluent limit guidelines, which are specific limits that certain industrial wastewater facilities would have to meet before discharging either to a municipal facility or directly to surface water. So we don't have any of those things that we have other values for that we can use, for example, to be like, there's a value, a standard, and therefore we can limit a discharge of this pollutant in a permit. We don't have that for PFAS for most of our permitting programs, which has been a challenge. And then we also don't have non-regulatory values for soil leaching values, which are a little bit different, sediment quality targets, and then screening values. And these non-regulatory values here are all used by our cleanup programs to determine if a site has been appropriately remediated. Here we go. So this is just an example. I had mentioned that we have drinking water standards. The Department of Health has a public interactive dashboard that shows all of the PFAS measurements based on the federal standards, federal drinking water standards across the whole state. And so they've been doing a lot of work to sample at community water systems. My point is not for you to be able to tell which system on this map has an exceedance of those, but to show that the vast majority, over 98% of these systems have been sampled. And it's hard to see, but the little purple circles are the ones that have an exceedance of those federal standards. Many of them here are in the cities, but there are water treatment plants across the state that have finished water that exceed those standards. So I always throw in a question. People are like, well, who pays to treat our drinking water? And it really depends on where you are. If you're in the East Metro, there's a good chance that 3M is paying for it, or at least part of it. There are also kind of recurring state and federal funds under the Drinking Water Revolving Fund. There is a state and a federal one, that's why they're both there. But bonding bills, of course, it's a bonding year, at least in theory, at the legislature. So folks are asking for money to upgrade their wastewater water treatment plants, in some cases to make up for a shortfall from the 3M settlement or other revolving funds, or maybe they don't have anybody that they can pin their contamination on, so they just need to ask for whatever money they can get. MPCA also had a grant for design and planning for communities that needed to design new water treatment infrastructure. So that didn't pay for the infrastructure itself, but at least could help plan for it. And then the last resort for most communities, right, is just increasing user fees for people who are connected to those water systems. But in some cases, that's the best they can do to pay for the upgrades they need. So I had also mentioned that we have surface water quality standards. I apologize for how small these numbers are. But this is 4 parts per trillion is what these are here, 0.004 parts per billion. These are the federal drinking water standards that are currently in effect. These are also our Class 1 water quality standards. Like I mentioned, in Minnesota, our rules incorporate those by reference. So again, looking at very small numbers. And the reason that these are 4 parts per trillion and not 0.000079 parts per trillion, which I think is the PFOA value that Department of Health has, is because under the Safe Drinking Water Act, you can include things like the cost to facilities to treat and the ability to actually detect compounds in drinking water in this case. So they settled at 4 because that's about as low as many labs could go as far as actually detecting PFAS in drinking water. And that was their threshold. It's 4 for PFOA and PFOS, and then 10 parts per trillion or 0.01 parts per billion for a few other compounds here, and then there is a hazard index, for mixture as well. Getting a little bit into the weeds, but just going to show that, again, these are very low numbers, and these federal numbers are higher than what we would necessarily have in the state. The Class 2 water quality standards are site-specific criteria that I mentioned earlier in the metro area. You don't need to look super closely at this, but this is the Mississippi River from Ford Dam down to Hastings or so. The St. Croix is contaminated because of this situation over here, which we call Project 1007. It's a little east of us now here in Shoreview, but basically in the 90s, there was a huge stormwater conveyance system that was built to move stormwater out of this area and into the St. Croix. And it turns out one of the creeks associated with this conveyance system runs right through the old Washington County landfill, which has a ton of disposed PFAS materials from 3M. So we inadvertently created this direct conduit into the St. Croix by building this stormwater removal system. So we've been now dealing with that, of course. But that is why there are criteria in this part of the river. And that basically means that facilities who discharge to this area need to meet those criteria. I also wanted to talk about fish consumption guidance. These are guidelines that the Department of Health publishes based on data collected by MPCA, DNR, Health, other agencies. And there's a Great Lakes consortium that actually works together to kind of talk about consumption guidelines across the Northern Great Lakes states and information sharing and things like that. But Department of Health does it for Minnesota. In the East Metro in particular, there are many lakes that we encourage people not to eat anything out of them because the fish there are contaminated with PFAS. Whether you're a sensitive population, which would include someone who may become or is pregnant, or children under the age of, I think it's 15. I don't know why 15 is the cutoff, but there's a reason for it. And then there are other kind of water body specific guidelines that might be specific to one type of fish, for example. So this is something that MDH, like I said, publishes. They update it, had pushed through a lot of updates in the last couple of years as our understanding changes and as some of the toxicology, the numbers underlying our calculations and assumptions has changed. But they plan to go to a more regular cadence of once every year or two here. And I apologize again, this is maybe a little bit small for folks to see, but I picked this example, which I got to use for Ramsey, Washington, and for this group, so great. Part of OWASO touches Shoreview, so it counts. And I wanted to just show the Department of Health has worked with DNR to incorporate their consumption advisories into this Lake Finder website, which is specifically for people who like to go fishing or recreate or whatever on a specific lake. So you can go to Lake Finder, enter whatever lake you want to look at. Like I said, I picked Owasso here, and it'll tell you if there are any fish consumption guidance. So there's a little info box here that says there's an advisory. In the case of Owasso, there's a statewide advisory, and those statewide advisories are mostly for mercury because we have mercury in Minnesota, unfortunately. So many of our lakes are impacted by that. But if you were to go to a different lake, and the good news for y'all is that I tried most of the lakes I could in Shoreview, and none of the ones I tried had an advisory on them, so I didn't find one in Shoreview, but Josephine does, and it's technically a stone's throw away. I grew up in Roseville. I went to Lake Josephine all the time. Yay. Anyway, so there is a fish consumption guidance for Lake Josephine, and you can see here, maybe you can see it. It is very small, but the idea here is it's intended to show an example of what this consumption might look like on Lake Finder. So for Lake Josephine, there's a do not eat advisory for all species of fish because of PFAS for sensitive populations. There are lakes that have a do not eat advisory for everybody, like Lake Elmo, Pig's Eye. There are some lakes that are so contaminated that you just should not eat fish out of there if you're concerned about PFAS anyway. But in this case, it's for sensitive populations. So just an example of what this might look like in real life here for folks. And then always questions in groups like this, community leaders and members that, what can we be doing as an organization, as a community, as individuals? I would encourage folks as a committee, as a community, to be amplifying the PFAS-related messages that our state agencies put out, whether that's, I think Ramsey, Washington, for example, had been like, oh, well, maybe we should be linking to Lake Finder on our website because they list all the lakes within that watershed district, and people could very easily go and see if there's a consumption advisory if they were to go to Lake Finder, for example. That's just an example that someone has said they might do. Amplifying information about PFAS and product prohibitions, talking with other groups, other local groups as possible. And then asking questions of each other, asking questions of people like me, other leaders, like people moving through the community. Something I've been asking people to look out for is, are you getting reports of foam on your lakes? PFAS like to foam. They really like that air-water interchange, and so they kind of hang out at the surface of water. So if you're seeing foaming events on high wind days or something, like that might be a sign that there's some contamination that hasn't been detected yet. Or if you, and this is again broader than just PFAS, but if you're seeing somebody putting something down a sewer, like whether that's an individual or a local business or whatever, like maybe that's worth flagging. And then just again, like I said, what are folks talking about? And I got a question when I presented in Forest Lake that I didn't answer very well. So I'm going to answer preemptively here about what individuals can do to reduce their exposure and potential risk. And the biggest thing an individual can do is to just be aware of Amara's Law and the associated prohibitions there. We're, as a state so far, are trying to take away the burden from individuals to have to make those decisions by having these prohibitions that should be more protective. So hearing if we as an agency or the legislature hears from the community that these are important, that they should be protected, take that opportunity if it arises, and talk about the prohibitions with your friends and family and say, well, PFAS in these products were prohibited. If you have a pan at home, that's probably okay, but maybe like all the Teflon is flaking off, it might be time to replace it. If you have one that's fine, you might as well continue using it. There's always a trade-off too, right, with everything of, well, if you throw it away, it just ends up in a landfill anyway. But those are personal choices that you can make. So Amar's Law is really trying to do that heavy lifting for everybody. So we're doing what we can to support that and advocate for it. And that's all I have. I might have gone a little bit long, but I might not have either, so.
I have a question on how many people are getting cancer. Do you have any statistics?
The question was how many people are getting cancer and what are the statistics about that? I don't have a number off the top of my head. What I can say is that the Department of Health did, by community request, a cancer cluster study in the East Metro. And overall, their findings were that they weren't finding what they would define as a cancer cluster there, based on the cancers that are associated with PFAS exposure. That report is on the MDH website. I can follow up with a link to it if folks are interested in seeing that. So at this time, our best understanding is that there isn't statistically a higher incidence of cancers. Anecdotally, there are a lot of kids in that high school at Tartan, I think it is specifically, that have gotten cancer, and it seems like that shouldn't be true in a general population. So the community experience might not necessarily be reflected in the like scientific statistical analysis that the Department of Health did, but that doesn't mean that there's not something there necessarily.
Is there a ranking of city and municipal water utilities, including Shoreview, as far as PFAS levels? Do we know anything about Shoreview's ranking?
Yeah, question is about where Shoreview and other cities are as far as PFAS in their drinking water. Yes, if you go to the, and I can follow up with this link too, the Department of Health has, it's called the PFAS dashboard for community water systems, something like that. But it lists every, or 98% of the facilities in the state that MDH has tested or finalized testing. And you can look up specific water treatment plants, and that's the finished water. So that's the water that's going out to homes and businesses and whatever. So yes, that information is available. Yes, sorry, yes, and Shoreview is fine. We've actually, interestingly, the only systems that have been impacted have been groundwater systems, and since most of, not all, but much of the metro area that's on like St. Paul water. I don't know if Shoreview's on St. Paul water or Roseville. Do you have your own water? Great, okay, well, never mind, this is not relevant. But St. Paul and Minneapolis pull their water out of the river, and so they haven't been.
For the people who choose to drink bottled water instead of municipal water, are there any reported standards for PFAS in those sources?
Question about if there's standards for PFAS in things like bottled water or delivered water. There aren't standards specifically for that, but because of the, before I say this, I'm not sure if our food packaging prohibition applies to bottles that water would be in. I don't know if water was considered a food. When the state provides water to parties that have been impacted by known contamination associated with a specific site, we provide water from known sources that have been tested for PFAS. We have, at least in the past, or maybe continue to test that bottled water brand or whatever to see if there are PFAS chemicals in there. But there are not standards specifically applied to that, no. Oh gosh, whoever.
First, thank you for being here. This is very interesting. So the 2018 3M settlement, what did that provide?
Great question. The question is about the 2018 3M PFAS settlement and what that covered. So I actually just did my own research into this because I'm writing a report. Anyway, so in 2018, the state settled with 3M for over $800 million. The majority of that, over $700 million, was earmarked for drinking water. That included drinking water infrastructure upgrades, operations and maintenance at water treatment plants that were affected. That includes providing safe water, bottled or otherwise, for people on private wells or whoever, I guess, needed it. And then it includes things like municipal hookups where possible, and in-home treatment systems, what we call point of entry treatment systems, or POETs. That would be like if you put a carbon filter system on your incoming water in your house, or an RO system. So the majority of that funding is going there. There is also a second batch of money called Priority 2 that's going towards specifically kind of natural resource related damage recovery. And that request for proposals for that funding closed last fall, I believe. And so those projects, the final projects that were awarded, have not been chosen or announced yet. But that's where that kind of the rest of that is. And then there's, of course, some significant overhead to administering the settlement. So we've got an entire unit at the MPCA, for example, and some people at MDH that are, their full-time jobs is working in East Metro communities to get that out. The state was able to invest a lot of that settlement money, so we've actually gotten some extra funding out of that, which was great, but it is likely to run out in the next year or two, which was many years before they thought it was going to, because of the just rapidly increasing costs of infrastructure upgrades and things like that. So
So is 3M also responsible for going back to the unlined landfill that they had and cleaning that up on their own dime?
question about whether 3M was responsible for cleaning up their old landfills and dumps. I'm going to say yes, because that's how our Superfund programs work. I'm not sure exactly how they are doing or have done that. There are different ways you could do it, and one of them is to just like pull everything out and line it and put everything back in. But I don't know, and I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. Yeah.
I'd also like to thank you for a very informative presentation on a really complicated topic. I think also with that settlement of 800 million, I believe the original ask was for 4 billion, and it was eventually settled at 800 million. And with the thought that the money would run out in a short time because of the expense of disposal that you had mentioned earlier on. Amara's law seems great, but I'm just wondering about enforcement. Many of these compounds are used in the production line and may never end up in the final product. But they're used as, say, foaming agents, as you mentioned, right? Various emulsion processes and whatnot for production. But I'm just wondering how in the world you enforce whether that part of it or the final products even. There are so many products, as you mentioned, tens of thousands of possibilities. And I don't envy your efforts to try to get a handle on that. Can you just address what the thoughts are on that?
Yeah. Thank you for that. The question boils down to how are we possibly going to enforce Amara's law and the other prohibitions, just given the expansive numbers of uses and types of uses of PFAS in in manufacture and commerce. The statute specifically does not require self-reporting for any of these manufacturers or sellers. There's a reporting rule that, they have to tell us how much PFAS is in their products and so on. But as an agency, we are responsible for enforcing Amara's law, which means we'll do our best to do product testing, since that's kind of the leading edge, if you will, right, of human exposure. And so that's where the focus is going to be. But that's a great question. I mean, the best that we can do is see who's using PFAS, encourage. Part of the point of reporting is not only for us to understand, for the public to understand where these compounds are, but also for people to have to look at their supply chains and see where it's coming from, right? A lot of the pushback we've gotten is like, well, we know there's PFAS in this, but they won't tell us how much or like what exactly it's in. And it's like, well, this is their requirement. You have to do what what EPA calls due diligence. We've worded it differently because due diligence doesn't actually mean anything necessarily, but it's kind of an open-ended question right now, right? It's going to be a lot of whack-a-mole. We have to assume that facilities and manufacturers are going to act in good faith to some degree, and if they don't, we'll have to be doing that testing. That kind of speaks to lab capacity as well, right? Like, we have staff at the MPCA that are responsible for doing that kind of testing and carrying out enforcement actions and things like that. But I think it's 2.5 people right now. So you can imagine it's going to be a massive undertaking. And, we do have the phase in starting in 25 of the products in those 11 categories. And so, of course, the initial focus will be on there, because there won't be any kind of unavoidable use considerations for those products. But, once we get past 2032, we're going to have to figure it out, I think. Yeah, it's not a satisfying answer, because I think we're still trying to figure out how we're going to do that too. But we will be responsible for that enforcement, and we will have to be taking those actions. Yeah.
And just one other question. What's the status of incineration as far as like mineralization of byproducts after they've been removed, say, from water or other sources? What's the status of that?
Yeah, question about the use of incineration to treat or destroy PFAS once they've gotten into media. There is a lot of research being done by EPA and some federal partners with DOD and even some facilities in the state of Minnesota looking at incineration. There has been some, how do I want to say this? There are some promising studies that show that high temperature incineration in particular may destroy PFAS. We're looking at efficiencies of up to, 99.9996% or something like that. So very much destroying most PFAS, but it's that like 0.00001 that we still are like, well, what is that? That's something, you're not necessarily breaking all the PFAS, you're just breaking up to some point that we can measure. So the question about mineralization is one we're still grappling with, right? Most of EPA's work has been at hazardous waste incinerators, which are very high temperature, and there's also a time component, right? It's high temperature. That temperature is sustained for a long time. But we can't measure mineralization yet. And so questions about like, well, this 99.999% count as destruction, but we can't actually like tell if we've mineralized everything, because there are unknown unknowns coming out of that process still. So incineration looks promising, and for what I would call the classical PFAS compounds like PFOS and PFOA, for example,
pretty good at destroying those carbon-fluorine bonds. But the question is, what's happening to the rest of it? Are we just like releasing these ultra-short PFAS that are going to be greenhouse gases, for example, but we can't measure them because we don't know how to measure them in air yet. There are just some physical limitations and analytical limitations that have made that difficult. In Minnesota, we're tracking, right, EPA's recommendations for disposal and destruction, which include thermal oxidation, incineration. EPA also says we should do deep well injection, which is not legal in Minnesota. And their third recommendation is landfilling. So the answer is nobody knows exactly what to do. There are a lot of really cool kind of bench scale, pilot scale studies that have been done with different technologies, and many of them are promising, but none of them have done work at like more than one site yet or at commercial scale. Yeah, so there is a lot of work looking at that. There are also a lot of policy decisions about how we would move forward with that kind of, like, do we as a state endorse one technology over another, or do we wait until all of the private sector kind of figures that out and then we can support what works best for different media, because there are considerations for that too, right? So that was kind of a non-answer. We're definitely keeping track. Incineration is intriguing. One of the other things that we're finding with all of these treatment, or what I should say, treatment will remove PFAS, but we're talking destruction, like actually breaking those carbon-fluorine bonds. Because that's so energy intensive, there are other considerations that are like the energy intensity required for that incineration, like that energy is coming from somewhere, right? There's a real trade-off to the amount of energy input on the grid, right? That would have to be used to treat or destroy PFAS at a statewide scale. Like that would cause huge emissions. Anyway, yeah, just like the energy intensity of it would have climate impacts. So it's like we're talking about all these big existential things and how they interact, and there's no straightforward answer, unfortunately, yet. No, there are no facilities that operate specifically to incinerate PFAS. There have been facilities that have incinerators that have looked at how their processes impact PFAS destruction. There have been some waste to energy facilities, for example, that have looked at PFAS destruction as part of their incineration when they incinerate the waste to turn it into energy. There have been a couple of electricity generating facilities, a couple Excel facilities that have used. There's one Excel facility, I should say, that did actual stack testing for PFAS emissions to try to see what was happening there at their facility. But the state has not been involved in any research. Yeah, yeah, probably they are. There are granular activated carbon regeneration facilities. There aren't, as far as I know, there aren't any in Minnesota, at least not currently in operation. And there aren't any hazardous waste incinerators operating in Minnesota right now either. Yeah, sure.